Picture this. You're sitting in a 2-5 game, maybe 2-5-10, maybe online mid-stakes. You've been playing for about 2 hours. The session has been fine. Nothing memorable either direction, just working poker, grinding through marginal spots, doing the things you know how to do. And then this hand happens. A player you've identified as a competent thinking regular opens from the hijack. You're on the button with ace-queen suited. The read is right. The stack depth supports it. The position is ideal. You 3-bet. He calls. The pot going to the flop is already bigger than most pots you've played tonight. Not enormous, but significant enough that both you and the villain are aware of it. The flop comes 10-7-2 with 2 spades. You don't have spades. You have 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw. The SPR is somewhere around 2.5. He checks to you. And here's the moment I want you to sit inside, because this is where the hand stops being about cards and starts being about something else entirely. You know what the range versus range analysis says you should do here. You've studied this. You have range advantage on this board. The correct C-bet frequency is high. You should be betting a significant portion of your range, and you should be betting for a specific size that applies the right amount of pressure relative to the remaining stack depth. But you don't do that. Instead, you feel something, a kind of resistance that doesn't have a clean strategic label. It's not exactly fear, not exactly uncertainty, but something adjacent to both. Something that says, be careful here. This pot is already large. If he check raises, you're in a real spot. If you bet and he calls and the turn is bad, you're going to be in an even bigger real spot. This hand could become the hand that defines the session. This hand could go very wrong. So you check back. You take the free card. You tell yourself it's pot control, which is a real concept, which is sometimes the right answer, which in this spot on this board with this range and this SPR is almost certainly not the right answer. But it sounds like the right answer. And right now, sounding like the right answer is all you needed to do. That's the moment this video is about. Not the flop texture, not the C-bet frequency. The moment the math moved one direction and your decision moved another, and the explanation your brain generated for the gap sounded just enough like poker thinking to let you believe it. Something happens to a poker player the moment they enter a 3-bet pot that doesn't happen in single-raised pots. And it's almost never discussed in strategic terms because it isn't fundamentally a strategic phenomenon. It's a psychological one. The objective changes. Not consciously. Nobody sits in a 3-bet pot and thinks, I am no longer trying to maximize my expected value. I am now trying to survive this hand without losing my stack. But that's the behavioral shift. You can see it in the aggregate data when you pull up your tracking software and sort by pot size. And you can feel it, if you're willing to be honest with yourself, in the texture of how you think during big pots versus medium pots versus small pots. In small pots, you play relatively freely. You make aggressive moves when the situation calls for them. You fire second and third barrels on reads that aren't airtight. You float in position on boards where your equity is thin, but your plan for the turn is reasonable. You play, broadly speaking, like someone trying to accumulate chips. In medium pots, you still play mostly this way, maybe slightly more cautiously, but recognizably the same player. And then the pot crosses some threshold, some number that varies by player and by stakes and by session context and by 100 other factors. And something shifts. The goal isn't maximizing EV anymore. The goal is not losing the pot in a way that hurts, not losing the pot to an aggressive move that puts you in a position you can't navigate. Not losing the pot in a way that turns an okay session into a bad one, or a bad session into a disaster. Playing not to lose. It's a phrase you've probably heard. You may have even used it to diagnose someone else's play. But it has a specific technical meaning in the context of 3-bet pots that most treatments of the concept don't capture accurately. Playing not to lose in a 3-bet pot means every decision is being filtered through a secondary criterion that has nothing to do with expected value. The primary question, what is the highest EV action here, gets answered. But before the answer gets executed, it passes through a second question. What is this action's potential to make this pot worse? Worse in the sense of larger, more committed, harder to escape, more likely to end in a full stack loss. And if the highest EV action scores poorly on that secondary question, the action gets modified, gets smaller, gets checked back, gets folded when the fold is technically premature. The modification feels like discipline. It feels like adjusting to the conditions of the hand. It feels, frankly, like the kind of mature, considered play that you associate with experienced players. It is none of those things. It is the mathematically suboptimal version of your game, produced by a psychological response to pot size that your brain has never bothered to disclose to your strategic reasoning. Let's get specific about why 3-bet pots create this response more reliably than other pot sizes, because understanding the structural features is the precondition for fixing the behavioral pattern. When you 3-bet pre-flop and the villain calls, you've arrived at the flop with a set of conditions that are categorically different from what you face in a single raised pot. The most important of these isn't the pot size itself, it's what the pot size means for every subsequent decision in the hand. The SPR going to the flop in a typical 3-bet pot is somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on stack depth and sizing. Compare this to a single raised pot, where the SPR is often 8 or more. This difference isn't just numerical, it's structural. It changes the meaning of every chip that moves. In a high SPR environment, a bet is a small fraction of what's at stake. You can bet and fold. You can bet and call a raise without committing. You have room to be wrong, room to be raised off a hand that's drawing thin, room to probe without attaching significant consequence to the probe. The low-pressure environment allows accurate decision-making because the cost of each individual decision is relatively small. In a low SPR environment, which is what a 3-bet pot produces, every bet is a substantial commitment relative to what's left. A 2/3 pot bet on the flop in a 3-bet pot with SPR 2.5 has already created a situation where both players are functionally committed on many runouts. The bet isn't just asking a question, it's making a statement. And statements, in high-stakes environments, produce ego responses that questions don't. There's also the range dynamic to consider. In a 3-bet pot, both players have substantially compressed ranges relative to a single raised pot. The 3-better is representing a range that starts with roughly the top 15% of hands. The caller is representing a range that specifically chose to see a flop against that range, which means it tends to be hands with playability, suited connectors, medium pairs, broadways, hands that have clear plans across multiple streets. What this means on the flop is that both ranges are stronger and more polarized than they'd be in a single raised pot. The likelihood that either player has a genuinely weak hand is lower. The likelihood that a bet gets called by a hand with strong equity against your range is higher. And the perception that bets in 3-bet pots are more likely to face resistance is part of what drives the defensive behavioral shift. The fear is calibrated to something real. The response to that fear is what's miscalibrated. Here's where the psychological analysis needs to get more honest than most poker content allows itself to be. Because what's happening in 3-bet pots isn't just a mathematical miscalculation. It's an ego response dressed up as strategic reasoning. When you 3-bet, you've done something declarative. You've told the table, and more importantly told the villain, that you have a strong hand or a specific strategic intention. The 3-bet is a statement of strength. The call is the villain declining to concede. The flop is where the statement gets tested. In this environment, large pot, compressed ranges, explicit declaration of strength already on the table, folding feels like a specific kind of failure that it doesn't feel like in other contexts. It feels like the statement was wrong. It feels like the villain looked at your declaration of strength and correctly assessed that it wasn't backed up. And this, the feeling of having been correctly identified as bluffing, or correctly identified as not as strong as you represented, activates an ego response that has very little to do with the chips. So the brain solves for ego protection rather than EV maximization. It finds lines that don't put the original statement at risk of being publicly refuted. Checking back the flop rather than betting preserves optionality. You can still see if the turn helps. You haven't committed to a narrative that can be disproven by a check raise. Calling a bet rather than raising, even when raising is clearly better, allows you to keep your options open, to avoid the finality of a large commitment that might go wrong. Folding to pressure before you absolutely have to isn't the worst strategic crime. But folding 10% too often over 10,000 3-bet pots is an enormous amount of equity surrendered to nothing except the desire to avoid situations where your ego can be damaged in large increments. The specific shape this takes varies by player. Some players overfold to aggression in 3-bet pots because calling down wide requires the ego tolerance to be wrong publicly, which they've decided is too expensive. Some players underbluff in 3-bet pots because the downside of a failed bluff in a large pot is a direct, visible, undeniable indication that they tried something that didn't work, which feels worse than not trying at all. Some players bet too small in 3-bet pots because small bets are hedged bets. They accomplish some of what a large bet would accomplish strategically, while limiting the ego exposure of having made a large bet that gets called and run down. In every case, the decision is being optimized for something other than expected value. And in every case, the optimization is doing it quietly, efficiently, and in language that sounds enough like poker reasoning that most players never examine it. Overfolding in 3-bet pots is one of the most costly and least examined leaks in mid-stakes poker. And it persists because the individual instances almost never look like mistakes at the time. When you fold to a check raise on the flop of a 3-bet pot with top pair, there are usually enough board texture considerations and villain-specific concerns and hand-reading uncertainties that the fold can be constructed as reasonable. And sometimes it is reasonable. That's the problem, because the fold is sometimes correct and sometimes incorrect. And the question that determines which, am I folding because the math supports it, or because the pot is too big for me to want to fight for, is a question that most players never ask cleanly. What overfolding in 3-bet pots actually looks like in aggregate is a fold-to-flop check-raise percentage that exceeds what the defending range would call for against a balanced check-raising range. It looks like a turnover fold that compounds the flop overfold. It looks like a river give-up rate that's elevated in 3-bet pots relative to single-raised pots in ways that can't be explained by board texture alone. The pattern operates across multiple streets and it builds on itself, because overfolding on the flop teaches the player to narrow the range they're taking to the turn, which makes the turn decisions even worse. You've eliminated the hands you should have defended with, so you're now playing with a range that's weaker than it should be, which makes calling or bluffing on the turn less correct, which creates an additional fold that compounds the original error. This isn't a leak that lives in one decision. It lives in the structural relationship between your decisions across streets and 3-bet pots. And cleaning it up requires understanding not just that you're folding too much, but why. Specifically, that the pot size is creating an emotional surcharge on the cost of being wrong that your strategic reasoning hasn't properly discounted. The practical consequence is that exploitative opponents, the players who actually pay attention to how you play, who track tendencies across sessions, who update their models of your range and your responses to pressure, these players find 3-bet pots against you to be unusually profitable. Not because your range is particularly weak, because your response to pressure in large pots is predictably more passive than balanced play would be. And predictable is exploitable, at any stakes, against anyone paying enough attention. The underbluffing side of this problem is equally expensive and even less discussed, because it doesn't feel like a mistake in the moment at all. It feels like restraint, like discipline, like not spewing in spots where the downside is significant. Here's the scenario. You're in a 3-bet pot. You're the pre-flop 3-better. The villain checks to you on a flop that heavily favors your range. Your continuing range here, the range you're constructing for the flop, should include not just your value hands but a meaningful proportion of bluffs, because a range that only bets when it has something is transparent and easily exploited. You know this. You've studied GTO enough to understand that a balanced betting range requires bluffs at a specific frequency to keep the villain indifferent between calling and folding. You know that the correct play is to bet a sizable portion of your air in this spot. But you don't. You check back a high percentage of your bluffs. You tell yourself it's because the villain is calling too wide, or because your specific bluff candidate has too little equity, or because the stack depth makes a bluff commitment unattractive. Some of these explanations are occasionally accurate. What they're all covering for, in the cases where they're rationalizations rather than analysis, is a simple truth. In a large pot, you don't want to be caught bluffing. Not because of the chips, because of what being caught bluffing in a large pot means in the social environment of the table. It means you put in significant money with nothing. It means you were read correctly. It means the villain correctly assessed that you were making a play, stood up to it, and took the pot. These events have a social weight that's out of proportion to their financial cost, and your brain, which is tracking social dynamics as carefully as it's tracking pot odds, responds to that weight by making bluffing in large pots feel considerably riskier than bluffing in small pots, even when the risk-reward calculation is identical or better. The result is a polarized betting range that's heavily weighted toward value and dangerously light on bluffs. Thinking opponents identify this quickly. They start overfolding to your bets in 3-bet pots, because they've learned that a bet from you in a large pot is more likely to mean something than game theory would suggest, which reduces the EV of your value bets while doing nothing to restore the bluffing frequency you should have. The underbluffing doesn't stay contained. It corrupts the effectiveness of the value betting it was trying to protect. Let's look at what this costs over volume, because the individual hand framing systematically understates the damage in a way that allows the pattern to persist. A mid-stakes player who plays with reasonable frequency might be involved in 3-bet pots, as the 3-better or the caller, perhaps 20 times per session on average. Some sessions more, some less, but call it 20 as a working number. Across those 20 pots, the combination of overfolding and underbluffing produces an EV loss that can be reasonably estimated in a range of $40 to $90 per session in aggregate, depending on stake size and how pronounced the tendencies are. $40 low estimate, 200 sessions a year. That's $8,000 annually from this one pattern. $90 high estimate, 200 sessions, $18,000. And these numbers still don't capture the full cost, because they account only for the direct EV loss of individual decisions. They don't account for the metagame cost, the loss of fold equity when players identify your 3-bet pot tendencies as passive, the loss of value from hands that would have earned more if the villains in those pots hadn't already learned that you're unlikely to fire multiple streets with nothing, the loss of implied odds when you're in the caller role and the 3-better correctly models you as someone likely to give up on turns and rivers when the pressure increases. The compounding nature of strategic passivity in 3-bet pots is what separates mid-stakes grinders from players who actually move up. Not the understanding of ranges, not the knowledge of equity, not the study hours, the willingness to play big pots aggressively when the range and position and board support it, and the psychological infrastructure to do that consistently rather than only when the session is going well and the ego isn't under pressure. The players at the next level aren't significantly smarter. They aren't playing a categorically different game strategically. They're playing the same game with less ego interference in the spots where ego interference is most expensive. Aaron, I want to introduce a concept here that I don't think gets discussed explicitly enough, even though every experienced player has felt it without necessarily naming it. I'm going to call it emotional SPR, the ratio of emotional stakes to emotional resources available to manage them. Regular SPR, stack-to-pot ratio, measures how much money remains relative to the pot. As SPR decreases, commitment becomes more likely, and individual decisions carry more consequence per chip. This is a structural feature of the hand that forces certain strategic responses. Emotional SPR works on an analogous logic. The emotional stakes of a decision scale with pot size, with session context, with identity investment in the outcome, and with the perceived permanence of the result. The emotional resources available to manage those stakes are finite, depletable within a session, and vary based on cognitive load, fatigue, prior outcomes, and a dozen other factors that have nothing to do with hand strength. When emotional SPR is high, when the emotional stakes of a decision exceed the emotional resources available to manage them without resorting to defensive reasoning, the decision-making changes in predictable ways. Players narrow their acceptable range of actions toward the ones with the most tolerable downside rather than the highest expected value. They prefer decisions that preserve optionality over decisions that commit. They find reasons to check when betting is correct, reasons to call when raising is correct, reasons to fold when calling is correct. The thing about emotional SPR that makes it particularly destructive in 3-bet pots is that it's not constant across the session. Early in a session, when you're fresh and the emotional resources are at their highest, you might play 3-bet pots reasonably well. But as the session accumulates weight, as the results trend one direction or another, as cognitive fatigue sets in, as the residue of previous difficult hands compounds, The emotional SPR in each successive 3-bet pot gets worse. The stakes feel higher, the resources feel lower, the defensive patterns become more pronounced. This is why you sometimes look back at late-session 3-bet pot hands and see a version of yourself that's visibly more passive than early-session hands, without any corresponding change in board texture or opponent tendencies. The boards didn't get harder. The opponents didn't get better. Your emotional SPR deteriorated across the session, and your decision-making deteriorated with it. Fixing this requires two things: understanding that emotional SPR exists, and that it operates on your decisions in ways that shadow the financial SPR, and building the session structure that manages it, that treats emotional resource depletion as a real constraint on decision quality and responds to it before it produces the expensive passive patterns rather than after. And if this is landing in a way that clarifies something you've been playing through without having language for, take a second and hit the like button. I know that's a familiar thing to ask at this point in a video, but I want to be direct about what it actually does. This channel is built around a specific kind of content. Not highlight reels, not strategy primers, not the kind of poker content that performs well because it's emotionally satisfying rather than genuinely useful. Building this kind of content and getting it to reach the players who would actually benefit from it requires navigating the same algorithm that every YouTube channel navigates, and that algorithm responds to engagement signals: likes, comments, watch time, shares. Those signals are what tells the distribution system that this material is worth showing to the next player who's stuck at mid-stakes, wondering why their understanding of the game isn't converting into the results it should. So if you like the video, it's the most direct way to support this channel reaching the audience it's built for, rather than getting buried under content designed for different goals. If you want more content at this level, serious, psychological, technically grounded analysis of the patterns that actually limit mid-stakes players, subscribe. The channel grows through the engagement of players who think carefully about the game. If that's you, the subscription is worth it. If this is the first video you've watched and it resonated, start here and go through the rest. The conversation builds. Leave a comment if something specific in this video identified a pattern you've been playing through. Comments do something useful both for the algorithm and for the direction of future content. They help me understand which specific patterns resonate with the audience and which deserve more detailed treatment. That's all. Back to the work. Let me give you the practical adjustments, because diagnosis without prescription is just pain recognition, and you came here for more than that. The most useful adjustment is also the most counterintuitive. Pre-commit to your ranges before the hand, not during it. What this means practically is developing the habit of making your flop decision framework before you see the flop. Before the board comes out, roughly what kind of board textures favor your range as the 3-better, what sizing you're going to use on those textures, and you know that you're going to execute that plan at the frequency the analysis supports, not the frequency that feels emotionally tolerable after seeing the board and feeling the size of the pot. Pre-commitment matters because it removes the ego interference from the in-hand decision. The decision about whether to c-bet this texture at this frequency isn't made in real time with the pot sitting in the middle and the villain staring at you. It was made earlier, when you were calm, when the money wasn't live, when the analysis could be honest. The in-hand decision is just execution of a prior commitment. This is harder than it sounds because real boards are varied, and real opponents have specific tendencies that create legitimate deviations from standard ranges. But the version of adjusting that most players do in real time is not legitimate deviation from balanced play. It's ego-driven deflection away from actions that feel risky because the pot is large. Distinguishing between legitimate adjustment and ego deflection requires, again, the habit of asking honestly, would I make this same deviation if the pot were half this size? If the answer is no, if the pot size is the reason for the deviation rather than the board texture or opponent tendency, the ego is doing the work. The second adjustment is learning to think in ranges rather than hands. This is standard advice, but it has a specific application in the 3-bet pot context that usually goes unstated. When you're thinking in terms of your specific hand, the ego stakes of every decision are high. This specific hand either wins or loses, and that outcome says something about whether your decision was right or wrong. When you're thinking in terms of your range, Individual hand outcomes are just variance within a distribution that the range produces over time. The range doesn't lose a single hand. Individual hands just contribute data points to a much longer run result. Playing range versus range rather than hand versus hand in 3-bet pots substantially reduces emotional SPR because the outcome of any individual hand stops being a verdict on your judgment. It's just one card flip in a long series. The judgment is in the range construction and the frequency decisions, both of which can be evaluated honestly after the session rather than defended emotionally during it. Here's the last thing I want to say, and I want to say it clearly because it's the framing that makes all of the analysis in this video actually usable. Playing to win in 3-bet pots is uncomfortable. That's not a failure of your psychological development. That's not a weakness to be embarrassed about. It's the accurate description of what it feels like to make high EV decisions under real pressure, with real money in play, and a real self-concept that has opinions about what the outcomes mean. The discomfort doesn't go away when you get better at the game. The players handling 3-bet pots correctly aren't comfortable. They're uncomfortable and doing the correct thing anyway. That's the distinction. Playing to survive feels better. In the moment. In each individual session. The checked back flop that avoids the check raise. The overfold that gets you out of the pot cleanly. The undersized bet that hedges between commitment and retreat. All of these produce a cleaner emotional experience than the aggressive, committed, fully exposed play that game theory endorses. They feel like the more experienced version of the game. They feel, and this is the specific lie they tell most fluently, like the approach of a player who has learned not to torch buy-ins in spots where the edge isn't clear. Playing to survive is expensive, not because it's necessarily wrong on any individual hand, but because it teaches the opponents at your table a model of your behavior that allows them to exploit you in ways that compound over sessions and months. Because it removes from your game the specific kind of pressure that creates fold equity, the pressure that only exists when opponents correctly model you as capable of applying force with both value hands and bluffs, never knowing which is which. Because it sets a ceiling on what your win rate can be, and that ceiling is specifically calibrated to protect your ego from the discomfort of being wrong in large pots. The choice between playing to win and playing to survive is made fresh in every 3-bet pot, every session, over the entire run of your poker career. There is no version of the game where the choice gets made once and then resolves permanently in one direction. You will face it again next session. And the session after that. What changes isn't the pressure. What changes is your relationship to it. The player who learns to enter a 3-bet pot and think only about range versus range, SPR, and board texture, who has genuinely removed the ego stakes from the calculation, not suppressed them, but removed them, by building a self-concept that doesn't live or die on the outcome of individual pots. That player plays the flop the same way whether they're up 200 or down 300, whether the villain is staring them down or stacking chips, whether catching the bluff would feel good or folding the best hand would feel bad. They play the hand, they play the range, they play the math, and the math, run out over enough volume, does exactly what it's supposed to do. The game doesn't owe you comfortable decisions. It owes you correct ones. Play the correct ones.